A very warm welcome to yet another edition of the Rebound series. My name is Farai Mwakutuya. I'm your host, and I thank you for joining us again. Now, today we're talking about Zimbabwe's infrastructure gap. It is well known and documented that poor infrastructure and the high cost of infrastructure constrain competitiveness and therefore economic recovery. Unfortunately, Zimbabwe has underinvested in its infrastructure for decades now, and as a result, we have systems, infrastructure, networks that are in a state of disrepair and in need of rehabilitation. There are efforts underway to try and fix that. Roads, airports, electricity, amongst many others. And today we'll be unpacking what's been happening, how it's happening, and how it could be better improved to ensure that we address and plug this gap. Joining me on the show for the first part of the show is none other than Masimba Marangwanda. He's the Director of Projects for Longdon Steel. Masimba, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Alongside him is a man who's closely and intimately involved with projects. His name is Tatenda Chimsoro. He's the Head of Corporate and Project Finance for Deloitte. Tatenda, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Let's get straight into it, and let me ask you, gentlemen, this. I was reading an African Development Bank infrastructure report on Zimbabwe from 2018. It says that the country needs to invest about $3.3 billion until 2030 in order to get our infrastructure back on track. This is not chump change. I mean, it just shows the enormity of the gap, of the challenge that we have. Can this be done?
I think it can be done. The important thing is to have private players come on board to invest. And the good thing with Tatenda here is that this is the type of language that they speak. Before you talk about infrastructure projects coming on board and you starting to see things happen, there's the funding aspect, which is very critical. Government can drive certain projects, right, which are important for the economy, but you need private players to come in. And when private players come in and they look at the type of investments that they want to do, you want to have policies that speak to this, right? Policies that talk about investment and return. So it's possible, but the question is, when we do policy, do we understand how capital works? When we want that capital to come in and invest in our infrastructure. So it's very possible, but the question is, how do you structure it?
Tatenda, do we understand how capital works?
Yes, we do, and I agree with Masimba to say, at the end of the day, I think government is trying, and we do have systems and policies in place, because if you look at ZIDA, they're actually pushing through, the drive towards the infrastructure development in Zimbabwe, and I guess maybe what we just need, is just a matter of structuring in terms of the funding. Who are we going to get the funds from, and what are the key sweeteners that we can put up to our investors out there to say, look, come and invest in Zimbabwe. These are the returns, and this is how we can structure the transactions. Yeah.
Talking about structure of transactions and issues to do with finances, I know an area that you are obviously very familiar with. Talking about policy, I know you've also, also been involved in terms of PPP, yes. Public-private partnerships. Are we doing it correctly, and how could we do it better?
Okay, I think there are lessons learned, from the previous projects that we have engaged in terms of, our triple P journey in Zimbabwe. But yeah, there are lessons learned, there are mistakes that we made, but we are actually learning in terms of certain aspects of how to structure these projects. But I guess what can be improved, is the issue of, remittability of foreign currency. I think there's a huge risk in terms of, if you invest into a project, let's say you're an external investor, coming from Dubai or South Africa, if you invest in Zimbabwe, how then are you going to, to recover your returns in terms of United States dollars? So I guess it's just a matter of, discussing with the authorities. Let's take, for instance, you have a chat with the Minister of Finance, RBZ, in terms of coming up with certain frameworks which can actually protect investors in terms of recoupment of their investments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is there no danger, though, of having different rules for different people?
Look, I think we can put up a blanket law, but obviously projects, they come in different, packages. So you can't have a one rule, but obviously you can say maybe for an investor in this sector, let's say sector specific, to say in energy, if you invest in energy, we can guarantee you probably, remittability of your dividends, of your interest or whatever, up to a certain period of time or whatever, during the concession period. So I guess we can come up with a law or regulations or statutory instruments. We can actually address that, but I think it's very key, especially for external investors.
Masimba, you're obviously, one of the leading private sector players that we are seeing in this space. Do you feel that there is an enabling environment for local players to participate? Because often when it comes to big projects, as outsiders, what we see is the international names coming in and running these things. So does that speak to a lack of capacity or lack of access?
Speaks of a bit of both, driven mainly by a lack of capacity. Remember, we're in an economy that had over 20 years of retrogression, which obviously affected even the construction industry, capacity-wise. Then you always have clients like mine where they do massive projects, and in those massive projects, they know that the local players don't have the capacity to do it. But what has also been happening, and we're very grateful that even the conversation from policymakers has been, try to involve local players so they build the capacity. Because you don't wake up with capacity. When we look at companies in countries like South Africa, they didn't just all of a sudden have capacity to build stadiums. They started somewhere and they always have local investment so that they can grow that capacity. So it's been encouraging in the past couple of years that we are now able to sit on a table and discuss issues to do with being involved in some of these projects. And I speak from experience when I say that it's a very positive direction that we need to go. What's also important for us as the players when we're given the opportunities to ensure that we invest in our businesses to grow that capacity. Because from where we are going, and I like how he touched on the formation of ZIDA. ZIDA has been very, very important. They're eventually going to structure massive projects in the next couple of years. Conversations have already started. I think even from his office, they're seeing structuring of transactions that are coming along. And when those things start to happen, we need to be able to sit on a table and say, this is the capacity that we have. We are willing, even if it means to partner as local companies together so that we're involved in the project. We might not be able to do it. Yeah, we might not be able to do it alone, but we can do it as a grouping. So I think it's very encouraging in the direction that we're going now.
Is there, that culture, I think what you're talking about, we've seen it in the past where consortiums come together and do that. Is there that single-mindedness or that unity, that consensus amongst players to say, look, we can actually work together and build capacity?
Yeah, we've actually done a project where we've actually gone together with a competitor of ours, where we sat down and we said, this is the project, this is how big it is. You take this portion, we take that portion. And when we went to sit down with the client, they were actually impressed to say, you know what, if you can come together and do this, I'm willing to take the risk to invest in you guys, right? In terms of looking across the border. And it's something that we also have to build, that type of culture, but it's important for our own survival. Because the worst thing is to want to go it alone and eventually realize that you cannot do it or are not going to be involved because we've just refused to work together. So it's a conversation that we need to have in our organizations and as well in the bodies that we report to. Yeah.
Tatenda, let me come back to you and say, what is clear and what has come through is that the state can't do it on its own and has to relinquish more of this responsibility. It has to be a space for private players to come in because they see this return on investment. They'll be more efficient. They'll deliver these things in a much better way. Do you get the sense that there is that willingness to let go and to relinquish some of that control?
Yeah. If we look at what's happening right now, I think there's appetite. If you look at the private sector, in working with the state, especially looking at our parastatals, because I think some of them they are actually failing to get the funding from government. So obviously you need your private sector players to come in. So I think there's a willingness, from the state, to engage with the private sector players to invest in our, parastatals and all that. Let's take, for instance, there's an issue for an NRZ. The government actually issued out a tender to say, can we have private sector players who can invest in NRZ, either debt or equity? So basically, I think there's willingness, but obviously there are certain aspects that we need to, just need to look at, who is willing to take the risk on certain aspects. And also government should be willing to take risk on certain aspects. Because I guess it's all around the risk allocation. But I guess the state is willing.
I suppose, when you mention NRZ, when you mention parastatals and state-owned enterprises, there has been talk for several years now. I mean, very, very many years of the desire to reform them, to sell some stakes off, but that hasn't happened. Is it because there aren't any takers, they aren't attractive enough, or is those issues where you're saying they've been bottlenecks along the way that have prevented some of those deals from actually coming to fruition?
Yeah, so I guess the takers are there and government is willing, but basically I think one of the key issues is all about risk. To say, where is the money coming from? Are the funders willing to fund your projects? So basically when the funders, when they're looking at the project, they look at country risk issues to say, how am I going to remit my my interest or my capital out of Zim? Even if you look at Zimbabwe credit rating now, I think we are almost not rated. So if you look at how they invest in these projects, they will look at engaging your insurance credit, like your ECIC in South Africa, to issue export insurance credit. So you see those companies like ECIC, they might not be in a position to issue those credit insurance to Zimbabwe because of its credit rating. So I guess it's one of the challenges that we have to say. I think what we need to sort out first as a nation is just to commit, to pay our debts so that we can start, uplifting our sovereign rating, so that we can attract that foreign direct investment or that debt, whatever, at state level. So I guess those are some of the key issues that we need to address.
Is this something that worries you or you've encountered in terms of being paid for what you've done? Or being worried that you may not get paid after you've delivered a project?
Yeah, we've delivered the project because we carry risk when you go into the project. And when you're done, there's a cost to the capital you've invested in the project, right? And that risk is evident. And there have been many projects that have defaulted, right? And how many times do you go around and you see a project that there was fanfare on it and now it's just stagnant, right? And there's no movement on that project. So like he says, it's a very pertinent point that needs to be answered for us to get our sovereign debt and make sure that we at least start getting government being rated, right? So that at least we get funding that comes in. You can imagine if you have a body that gives export insurance and they're actually not willing to insure, right? That's not a good look, and it has to be dealt with.
So we need to pay what we owe.
We have to pay what we owe.
Yeah, not necessarily saying we need to pay it now, but at least there should be, a sort of a plan, and let's say maybe we are paying certain percentage each and every year, so that we start paying. Because obviously we owe a lot, but yeah, it's something that we cannot be done overnight. But showing willingness and actually trying to pay something like this is one of the key stepping stones towards.
Plans, roadmaps, and way forward certainly is what you're speaking of, and that is what we'll be tackling when we return on the Rebound series, looking at Zimbabwe's infrastructure gap and looking at what the priorities should be. What do we fix first, and how we go about it. Stay tuned. Every Zimbabwean wants their country to return to its former glory, and we believe that we have a role to play in doing that. So we'll be speaking to different Zimbabweans from different facets of life to share their views of what it will take to get Zimbabwe to rebound. The Rebound series comes to you every Friday between 5 and 6 p.m. on the Heart and Soul digital platforms. Join me, Farai Mwakutuya, for those incisive discussions. We call this effort the Rebound series. My name is Farai Mwakutuya, your host. And my guests once again are Masimba Marangwanda, Director of Projects for Longden Steel, alongside Tenda Chimsoro, Head of Corporate and Project Finance for Deloitte. We're talking Zimbabwe's infrastructure gap. Masimba, let me, take you a bit into your personal space. We see you very active on social media and seemingly very upbeat about what's happening in Zimbabwe, but at the same time, there are many people who seem to paint a picture of desolation, of despondency. We've just been talking now about the fact that many projects are held up because of the credit rating, and Zimbabwe is seen as this country where you can't get anything done. How do you reconcile your optimism, your the spring in your step, and what's happening?
So, if you look at our journey, and what I've just been trying to do of late is to try and just highlight the active projects that are there. We have, like you're saying, like there's this despondency that's there, that things are not working, everything is broken down, and not to say that that's not true, but on the other end, there is no communication that shows what is actually happening. And with each project, it's employment, it's people on site, it's suppliers being given work to supply, and it trickles down with that ripple effect everywhere. And what I've seen is that there is encouraging signs from the construction industry that there's potential growth, right? Q4 last year, PPC and Lafarge were struggling to get product into the market, right? We were running projects where clients were struggling to get concrete poured, right? And it was all demand, right? And we also see it in our business that we are getting increased demand compared to the numbers we're seeing from the past 2-3 years, right? So those are encouraging signs where we are saying at the trajectory that we are going, in terms of the conversations that are happening, there's this potential to grow the construction industry. And I even tweeted one day to say it would be good for government to actually start publishing labor numbers to show how many people are now being employed. Because if our industry in terms of construction is getting work, who are the clients that are investing in construction, right? Because we are the doers. We are doing for who, right? And what does that mean for their type of business? So if the supermarket chains, like 2 or 3, were doing expansion projects. When I was traveling from here to Victoria Falls, I saw that one of the fuel companies was doing expansion in terms of new service stations. This is all different sectors of the industry that are now investing and throwing money into construction. And like, if you really look at it, with the economy we have, if you have money that you're sitting on and you want to build a house, if things are not good, you are going to hold on to your cash, right? Because you're looking at the potential risk. But how many new housing developments are coming up? How many banks are now talking about saying we want to invest in housing because the demand is there for housing? People are willing to come in and buy. And we're not even saying that the banks are actually rolling out enough mortgages for everyone. Now, what happens when they eventually do come onto the market and say, okay, there's stability here, I think we can give people mortgages in local currency. That becomes additional demand that's going to come into the market. So this is what I see, because what we see at this point is probably what people will see a year or 2 from now, the general public. We know it now, we're working on it now, and that's why I have this so-called spring on my step.
So you talk about, and I think it's something that's, again, very pertinent, a lot of projects underway, failure to meet demand, a lot of construction and things like that. Unfortunately, I would imagine a lot of the raw materials, or a significant amount of the raw materials, are being imported. Is there a plan, or what needs to be done to ensure that, we now start to build local capacity to produce some of these raw materials, the fixtures and fittings and all these other things that are required?
Okay, yeah, I guess if I look at raw materials within construction industry, looking at, let's take for instance, Longden, they, specialize in steel, So basically, you look at companies like your Zisco, it's a key player in terms of, construction boom, so that, we can actually upscale our downstream industries. So I guess it's just an issue of, government trying to, to sort out issues around, our SOEs, so that at least we can also support the locals and also try to support the downstream industry. Because obviously the reason why we are importing at the end of the day is because probably we don't have capacity to meet the demand. We don't have those companies, which are up and running. So at the end of the day, it's all about, sorting out these downstream industries. We are talking of your Zisco, your NRZ, your Zimforce, so that at least they can supply whatever, the amount of steel which is actually needed in the construction industry.
It's a real missed opportunity, Zisco, isn't it, in terms of just the capacity to supply local demand, but also regional?
In 2006, between 2006 and 2008, before the World Cup, that was the peak of consumption of steel in South Africa, where the 3 mills in South Africa were giving 6-month lead times for product. And I remember I was sitting with a big player in SA, and he says, as the steel body, they just shipped $4 billion to buy steel out of Turkey. Wow. And he said we could have at least given $1 billion to Zisco, right? When you look at that, you realize the opportunity that we missed. And with each passing year, and like he says, it's an opportunity that government needs to move on very quickly. We need to get Zisco back online and all the other SOPs. The TSP talked very highly on how Minister of Finance was saying we need to shed off these things, give them to private players and get them resuscitated. But we're just not seeing it move quick enough. And you look at NRZ as well. That is a key player. In our industry, moving material by road is very expensive. When you go to Zisco, they had railway sidings that were going all to all the suppliers, right into their depot. And you move more for less. So the downstream effect, right, helps us to be competitive. And you touched on something. How do we then now start having local players manufacture so that we import less? COVID was a very interesting period, right? Because businesses learned to adapt without necessarily having to turn to imports. China was struggling to ship. Ports were not handling a lot of cargo. I know a few mates of mine who work for Investec, and they have a division that deals with clearing of ports, right? And they were talking about how it was almost dead because China was not trading. But for some strange reason, we still managed to get products, right? And I think this is something that is very pertinent, very key for our economy going forward. Policymakers need to move quickly to make sure that our SOEs go into private hands, right? I have absolutely nothing wrong with government taking a stake. They can take 10%, right, of these SOEs. But it's important for them to move quickly, to move these SOEs so that they resuscitate it, right? So that at least we start having local production.
Now, talking about, I mean, you've said it's priority, it's urgent that these SOEs are sorted out. I pointed out earlier that our infrastructure is in dire need of refurbishment, of upgrade, of improvement. Roads need to be fixed, railways, electricity grids, airports, so many things need to be fixed. But we can't do it all at the same time. So the question I would ask and put to you is, where do we start?
Yeah, okay. It's a difficult question, but I guess I can refer that to the NDS1. So if you look at the NDS1, they've got what they call priority projects. And they are looking at your energy, which also encompasses your energy efficiency and, renewable energy products. And they look at transport and infrastructure, space, in terms of making sure that our road network, our rail network is in order. Because if you look at energy, they actually sort of the backbone of all the other sectors. Because for you to produce steel, you need energy. Yeah. So at the end of the day, I guess we already have priorities to say we can start with energy, we can move to transport. But I guess, at the state that we are right now, I guess maybe we just need to do certain things concurrently. To say probably we can allocate maybe 60% to energy, 30% to transport, or 20% or maybe to any other key, sectors within the economy. So I guess it's not, there's a priority, but I guess we just need to do certain things hand in hand. Yeah.
I agree with him. 100%. Energy is paramount. It's key. At least Wange 7 and 8 are currently running, and even with lockdowns, the project is not too far behind. So that is going to be a very important aspect when they switch it on. That we need energy, and not only just need the energy, we need energy at the right price for production to be cost effective. So the NDA speaks about that. It talks about how priority projects are very important.
Right price. Earlier we spoke, you've just said energy at the right price. Earlier you spoke about investors needing to get their return back. We need to repay that debt. So how do you price? How do you price? I'm sure they'll be pricing it with a view to paying back.
I think from the energy sector, because we've got the Southern African Power Pool head office here, for those who come and invest, when they put it into the power pool, they'll be able to have some form of return. I know the Ministry of Energy will have details on how they'll be structuring these transactions, because obviously whoever comes in, and we look at how there's a lot of interesting activity in the solar space, right? A lot of people who are doing solar obviously want to get their money returns, and it looks like there's great potential in that sector. So surely there should be a way where they're structuring it and getting their return, but also being viable, because there's obviously going to be a price point that makes sense for our economy. We don't want to pay too much in terms of energy, because we will not be competitive. Yeah. So I think there should be a formula they're working with that seems to be working.
Turning to you, Tatenda, structuring, again, something that you were...
So in terms of pricing, and I agree with what Masimba is saying, to say, look, you need to have an optimum sort of a tariff, so that you can take care of your investors together with your consumers at the same time. But basically, there's always a trade-off. If you need a low tariff, then someone has to give in. So let's take, for instance, probably government. We have to come up with some incentives or certain waivers. Let's take, for instance, if I'm coming up with a project in terms of energy, maybe I'm setting my tariff at 14 cents per kilowatt, and the government is saying you need to set your tariff at 10 cents or 9 cents. So what it simply means is that government has to chip in. Probably they can waiver my taxes. Let's take, for instance, I will not pay VAT for a certain period of time, so that at least I can actually recoup some of my investments. So I guess it's just a matter of structuring, how you structure it. Whether you go with the market rate, the market price, or you can try to negotiate with government to get certain waivers so that at least the project can be viable.
Okay. Yeah. We spoke earlier, I said, which should be the priorities. You listed those, and how should those be? We've got the PPP Act now. Should that be how we are rolling these things out across the board, or a hybrid of sorts?
Yeah, we can always do a hybrid, because I know there are certain sectors where we cannot say, okay, maybe, those which are sensitive for security reasons, where you cannot involve private players. So obviously government can actually take those sectors. But looking at, key sectors like your transport and other things, probably we can engage in PPPs, because obviously they are more efficient, in terms of risk allocation, in terms of value for money and other things.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Okay. Gentlemen, I must thank you for coming through. We must end this segment of the program now, but I think it's been very informative, very insightful, and I think also very positive in terms of what's happening and the potential that is there. I want to thank you for coming through, Tatenda and Masimba.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
We're taking another short break here on the Rebound series. Do stay tuned. We'll be back and focusing, zeroing in more on that energy sector. I think many people have qualms, have issues with not having enough power domestically and in terms of industry. And so we'll be talking about that when we return. Every Zimbabwean wants their country to return to its former glory, and we believe that we have a role to play in doing that. So we'll be speaking to different Zimbabweans from different facets of life to share their views of what it will take to get Zimbabwe to rebound. The Rebound series comes to you every Friday between 5 and 6 p.m. on the Heart and Soul digital platforms. Join me, Farai Mwakutuya, for those incisive discussions. Welcome back. The Rebound series continues now. Earlier, I did speak to my two guests who both made mention of the fact that the key priority, the key enabler going forward is electricity and energy. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll now give time and focus to that particular area. And joining me for this segment of the program is none other than the Secretary for Energy and Power Development. Welcome to the program, Dr. Gloria Magombo.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, I was having a discussion earlier with two gentlemen who are in the infrastructure space. They both said that electricity and energy development are key to Zimbabwe's, addressing Zimbabwe's infrastructure gap. Could you tell us where we are in terms of several projects that we've heard are on the cards? What are their status?
Okay, thank you. I would like to agree with you and the previous speakers that energy is key to unlocking value from the economy. And as the energy sector, before I speak to the projects, I'll just give you a high-level overview in terms of where we are with energy supply at the moment. As you are aware, we get our power mainly from about 5 power stations within the country and a number of independent power producers who produce power which is fed into the grid. We have our main generating station being Kariba now. It's our biggest station at 1,050 megawatts. And we also have Hwange with an installed capacity of about 920, but currently doing less than about 400 megawatts. We also have the small thermals, fairly old, doing an average of about 45 megawatts amongst the 3 of them. The issue which we have is then that we also have independent power producers who are mainly currently supplying power from hydro, mini hydros, and also have a few solar PV, which is feeding in about 4.5 megawatts into the grid. So in total, from internal generation capacity, we are looking at about 1,300 megawatts. Our demand at the moment sits between 1,500 and we are moving slowly towards 1,600 megawatts. At our peak as a country, we moved almost up to 2,000 some years back. So we are coming back slowly. So from the 1,300 I spoke to and the 1,500, which is the current demand, and because we're going into winter, it's going to be even increasing higher. We are looking at 200 megawatts to 300 megawatts during peak, which has to be imported. And that power is imported from South Africa and also from Mozambique. So, and as we plan through this NDS1, we are looking at an economic rebound, like you said, and that growth will require an additional about maybe we are looking at targeting at the highest, most optimistic development plan about 10,000 demand by 2030.
Okay.
So with that, we have a number of projects which have been licensed by ZERA, but we have other projects which, having been licensed by ZERA, which are already under construction. And the main project which we are looking at is Unit 7 and 8 from Hwange, which are going to add 600 megawatts from that plant, which is coal. But we also have another small independent power producer who's going to bring in about 50 megawatts by end of this year of also thermal coal. We then have about 4 or 5 projects for solar, which are also under construction. One in Seke, which is just after Dema, Harawa. We have Solgas, which is in Cross Mabale. We have another 2, one in Gwanda. All these projects are at their different levels of construction, and they have, whilst Harawa is got a potential to produce up to 20 megawatts, there's already 6 megawatts which should be coming online over the next 2 to 3 months, which has already been installed and is now there. We also have a number of projects which are still at developmental stage, because for us, for power projects, they start with a pre-feasibility study, then we go for full feasibility and licensing. And project development takes a bit of time. So we do have a number of projects which are still under the developmental stage, which have not gotten to financial closure, which are now promising. And we expect them also to be implemented over the next 5 years. And I think typical project which we know and is huge is the Batoka project. Yes. So that one has a number of processes which have already been done. The full feasibility study has been done and completed. Over the last 3 months, there has been the final disclosure on the environmental impact assessment program, which then goes back to the various stakeholders, which has been done and completed. The consultant is now finalizing and compiling the final report. We have also on both sides been allocated the project development sites. And I'm sure you're aware that there was a land excision in the Batoka site on the Zimbabwean side. We are already engaging various stakeholders together with the Wange Rural District Council, looking at developing that area with, on our side, our utilities HStvZim being the one which is leading the program of actually coming up together with the Ministry of Local Government with the site plans and the whole program. So there's a lot of work which is happening in the background, and there's still also negotiations and discussions with the developer on that. So maybe I can stop here for now.
Certainly. A couple of things from what you've just mentioned. Number one, our power mix or energy mix certainly has a big component of thermal power at a time where there seems to be a global push to move towards cleaner sources. Yes, you've mentioned hydro and solar, but thermal still constitutes quite a significant amount. How sustainable is that? And how do we reconcile wanting to be cleaner and more environmentally friendly, but we continue to invest in those projects?
I think if you look at the renewable, the future of energy, there's no doubt that it's renewable, and it's still in transition. There's a lot of work and innovation which is ongoing in terms of storage part. However, you find that in a lot of countries, there is still a significant portion which thermal does constitute, especially with regards to base load. The reason being that when we speak to solar, most grids connected solar does not have storage, and solar works during the day. So whilst we are going green, without storage, which is currently coming at a much higher price, obviously over the years the cost has come down significantly, but it's still quite expensive as compared to having a coal-fired power plant or gas-fired power plant, which is also thermal. And so we are also looking at potential for CSP, which is concentrated power, concentrated solar plant, where you can then have maybe molten salt, which is heated by concentrated the mirrors, and then you can at least have storage maybe up to 4 or 5 hours post. And also the issue of renewables, if we now look at others other than just solar, where we look at wind, they tend to be variable. They are not at times consistently blowing, or the sun is not shining all the time. So you want that base load, which in some of the development countries is made through nuclear as base load. So we want that base load, and for us as Zimbabwe, coal is one of those resources which we have naturally in the country, which we need to exploit. But the good thing is that if you look at a power plant which was built 30 years ago, like Wange Power Station, there were certain designs which were there then, which did not, were not as clean as new coal plants are now. You realize that with the new coal plants which are coming up, we are also bringing in some technologies which can help up clean the gases, especially like of carbon dioxide, through using lime, which is a very high absorbing carbon dioxide, absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide. We also put in better filtering systems to ensure that we clean the gases as they leave the turbine. So we are not just doing coal, but we are doing it in a cleaner manner.
You mentioned nuclear, that some countries use that as their baseload.
Yes.
We've also seen some reports suggesting that that could be an option, or projects in that sphere under discussion or investigation or exploration. How real is that? Or is it just,
I think if you look at our energy policy as far back as 2012, when we did the initial energy policy, we identified all the possible forms of energy which this country can use. And that identification was based on the resources we have as a country. So if you look at nuclear, if you have uranium, you can then do that. The issue about the latest MOU which we signed is for peaceful use of nuclear, which means it can be used for energy generation, it can be used for hospitals, because there's a lot of equipment and which is used by hospitals, agriculture, which uses nuclear energy. But we are also signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So when we are looking at anything to do with nuclear, we are looking at long-term development strategy. And with the MOU which we have come up now is for capacitation, because if you, as members of the EIA, there's a protocol which you follow for you before you can actually get to a level where you are producing nuclear for power generation. And that includes making sure that you have set up a proper capacitation program with the experts which you require to run such facilities. And it will take us a bit of time as a country, but what we have done in signing the MOU is to start the process of that preparation. It will take maybe 10 or so years before we get to a level where now we are able to. But in the process, now we can start training our nuclear scientists. We already have some who are operating in different countries around the world. We are also looking at setting up the necessary regulatory frameworks and laws which will then allow us to be able to implement this. We are also looking at partnerships with countries which have already have such developed technologies, which can also help us to hold our hand as we then develop the capacity towards that. So it's something which we will form part of our energy mix as we move forward, and we will follow the due processes to ensure that it's done in a safe way. I think one of the issues people are always afraid of with nuclear, with the international disasters which we have had, is whether we have the capacity to handle it in a safe manner. And that process is what we are starting now, to develop that capacity to do so.
Let me stop you there, Dr. Magombo. We need to take a short break. This is the Rebound series. When we come back, we'll continue this discussion, turning to more, the issues that I know frustrate many Zimbabweans and that many Zimbabweans have interest in, the power utility, the supply of power. Will we be able to service these debts? Will we have, more load shedding? All that and a whole lot more coming your way. It is the Rebound series. Every Zimbabwean wants their country to return to its former glory, and we believe that we have a role to play in doing that. So we'll be speaking to different Zimbabweans from different facets of life to share their views of what it will take to get Zimbabwe to rebound. The Rebound series comes to you every Friday between 5 and 6 p.m. on the Heart and Soul digital platforms. Join me, Farai Mwakutuya, for those incisive discussions. We're continuing our discussion here, focusing on the energy sector. My guest is none other than the Secretary for Energy and Power Development, Dr. Gloria Magombo. Ma'am, before we went to the break, you were talking about our power generation capacity, and that going into winter as we are now, there will be need to import some of this power. We do know from the past that we've been importing power, but we've heard that we haven't perhaps been as prudent in servicing those debts. Are we paid up?
When you have a running contract in terms of what we have, in terms of the current power purchase agreements with our different suppliers, those are serviced from time to time. Obviously, the utility does have some outstanding debts with some of their suppliers, which they are servicing up. However, they have challenges with some of the debt service due to the level of tariffs which we are having in the country. So there are some mechanisms which we are coming up with and strategies which we are coming up with to ensure that they are able to remain viable, which require that they charge a cost-reflective tariff. It's something which is always been considered by government, and various stakeholders are looking at that in terms of how do we reach cost reflectivity whilst to allow ZESA to be able to recover sufficient revenues to meet all their operational costs. At the moment, their tariff is a bit sub-economic, but like I've said, processes are in place to look and see how best they can so that they're able to meet the requirements. But over and above that, whilst we have spoken to the issues of our ability to service our debt, we have come up with a mechanism where we have exporting customers who are then ring-fenced to ensure that we are then able to service our debt. Obviously, we don't collect the full amount which is equivalent to what we are actually importing, so the other amount ZESA has to go to the auction floor to look for that, and also they have to collect the money to be able to pay that debt. I would like to take this opportunity at this point in time to say that to Zimbabweans, it's important that we remain also current in our own electricity bills, especially for those who are who pay post the consumption instead of prepayment, because it helps the utility also to meet its own other obligations. So you find that one of the key areas where we have had serious challenges is with the collection, where ZESA is owed billions by customers who have not paid, but they're expected to be also paying their suppliers. So that is then carried over to their suppliers as well. So I would like to urge Zimbabweans to ensure that they also pay timeously, and those who are on prepayment, they also pay on time. It's a challenge which we have always had over the past years, but I think I'll speak to that later as we address the other issues.
How much of, I mean, you've mentioned the sub-economic tariff, and I certainly heard recently that an application or permission has been sought from ZERA for an adjustment. I think it's 10 cents, 10% adjustment. But how much, because we often hear of bloated cost structures, inefficiencies within the power utility itself, which could be contributing to it not being able to fulfill its payments and things like that. Are there efforts to try and address that? Because that may also affect the efficiency and ultimately how much they need to charge.
I think the issue of bloated structures and efficiencies is currently being addressed because government through cabinet made a decision to restructure the ZESA group of companies, and we have already appointed consultants who are currently working on, and within the next 2 to 3 months we will have a clear report and recommendations which will then be submitted to cabinet for approval. So the process of addressing these structures is in progress, but there are some issues which are quite pertinent to ensure that they address the costs. There are some basic costs which we can't run away from. If we are importing power at about 7 to 12 cents and we are selling power at 5 cents, obviously they would you don't need to be a rocket scientist to see that we need to ensure that we move the power to the right level. It's important that the utility continues to review its costs. It's audited annually, and any wasteful expenditure would be identified through audited systems. However, we are saying that there is need for parties to ensure that ZESA is viable, and an independent study has been commissioned which is looking at the cost of supply. And when such studies are done, we don't look at just the current cost of supply, but that cost is also then adjusted to efficiency levels, and it's also benchmarked against similar facilities regionally so that people can see how. So we have a study which is ongoing now, which is going to be read, I think, by end of June. And with that study, we want to see how the cost structures have moved over and where are the areas where there is wasteful expenditure. But what I've said is that as long as you are selling your product below cost, obviously no amount of efficiency will help addressing that. So as Zimbabweans, I think we also have to realize that it's important to support our utility and make sure that it's able to meet its cost. And such applications are natural everywhere in the region. Utilities, on an annual basis, once they've done their budgets, they go to their regulators to then apply for changes which are related to inflation, changes in exchange rates. Obviously, these are the issues which they are doing. It's a natural application and process which has to be interrogated by a regulator who is independent, and part of it is to ensure that whatever costs are then allowed in that application then are done in a prudent manner, and they are actually incurred prudently.
You mentioned the need to restructure the power utility, and what concerns me there is, years ago it was unbundled, bundled, and there seems to be no definitive or what we did at the time we were told would be for better efficiency. Clearly it hasn't achieved that. So what is, for lack of a better term, a guarantee that what will be done now will deliver what we're looking for? Or do we keep going around in circles?
I think the reasons why we are doing what we are doing is because there was an analysis that at the time, if you go back to the unbundling program, it started in the early 2000s, where there was the Electricity Act, which provided for an independent regulator. One of the reasons why the unbundling was done was to also allow for private sector participation in the creation of an independent regulator, so that ZESA could then have various companies, in this case maybe it's part of the value chain, like the generation part, being able to compete against other suppliers, in this case who are the independent power producers. And that process was started. However, there was still the retention of a holding company which remains being there. And over the years, people have looked at the whole process of unbundling. Yes, the certain parts of that have already been achieved. We have licensed, we've created an independent regulator, we have licensed independent power producers, and the next issue was to see that total separation of the different companies under ZESA. That didn't happen because we are still a growing economy, and people looked at the efficiencies which were there and achieved, and the new cost structures, especially at the top. Then there was a decision to say, since we really never fully unbundled, we might as well collapse this structure into one, so that we achieve the efficiencies we need, especially with this new dispensation, so that we concentrate more on specific projects which we want to achieve, rather than running with all the different structures, which can also cause bureaucratic delays in approvals, where you have the subsidiary having to go to the next board approving another board's decision. So the decision was to really collapse these structures for efficiency and easy and quick decision making, so that projects can be implemented. The energy sector in general is in transition. There is a lot of changes which are coming up with the sector, such that if the need comes up later, the country should be able to look at this and evaluate the implementation of certain policy decisions, and still make decisions which will make it operate better. I don't think structures should be cast in concrete to say, because we once made this decision and it didn't work to the level which we wanted, and we can't make a different decision. And there are some countries where both systems work, where if you go to the United States, for example, they have states where they have vertically integrated utilities. They have other states where they have unbundled utilities, but they still work. I think what is key is we need to be very clear and focused in terms of what we want to achieve. Being efficient and be cost conscious, kill any corruption which can be there, be able to collect what we require as a utility. And once we put all these systems in place to ensure that we deal with those issues, the structure might neither be here nor there.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I want to ask something that, again, was talked about a lot. We perhaps don't hear often anymore about, but how far are we with rural electrification?
Oh, rural electrification is one of my favorite subjects to speak to, because it's an area where we have a clean slate and where we are doing a lot of projects which can even embrace this renewable energy going forward. I think Zimbabwe has been working on rural electrification over the agency. The Rural Electrification Fund was formed in 2002. Prior to that, the utility ZESA was responsible for rural electrification. So it's something which has been going on over years. The only reason why an agency had been formed is because government saw an opportunity to accelerate the rural electrification program by ensuring that we come up with a levy which can then be used to do programs in all the different provinces. And as we speak right now, I think as of 2020, I'll have to check my statistics, we have achieved electrification of about 61% of our primary schools are electrified, and 70% of the rural secondary schools have been electrified, and we have about 88% of the health centers which have been electrified. The program is run on a levy which is paid by electricity consumers, 6%, and then there's also allocations from Treasury, and we also have had grants from different cooperating partners which have helped us to do certain programs. Over and above grid extensions, which what most of the statistics I've given you have been attributed to, Rural Energy Electrification Agency has come up with a rural energy master plan which has mapped the whole country and has identified the least cost for electrification in different areas. We know that in our rural areas we have very sparsely populated areas where lines from one household to another can be very long without much demand coming from the other side. So as part of our rural electrification program, one of the issues we are trying to work on is that we link most of the grid extensions to end user infrastructure as well, so that when you draw a grid into a community, you are also linking it to some production. So you find that all the new rural electrification programs include electrification of a business center, where you or an irrigation scheme, which will then allow for those areas to generate income, which will allow them to even consume more electricity and create the demand, other than just having a long line which goes to this place, but they're just drawing enough power for lighting only and a little bit. So the program is ongoing, and the future is that part of the program will remain grid extensions, which will continue. A lot of the developments which we want to work on the next 5 years is going to be mini grids, where we are going to use renewable energy as hybrid with other sources and some storage to ensure that we supply these schools, clinics, and other developed business communities with power, which will be reduce the cost of drawing these long lines. So we are also looking at the exploration of biodigesters using the rural electrification fund, because most of the power which is used in schools was used for cooking, and also, or if where they were not using power, they were using firewood, which was leading to deforestation. We are now encouraging the use and construction of biodigesters, institutional biodigesters for schools, and also encouraging households in Zimbabwe to start building biodigesters even for households so that they can use biogas for cooking instead of, as long as the household is about 3 or 4 or 5 members, that is enough for a family of 6 from the cow dung to use for a biodigester. So as part of the rural electrification, we are coming up with a master plan which is looking at all the energy needs rather than just the lighting and electricity, but also for cooking and also for
our main focus
production.
Our focus has obviously been on energy and electricity, but because we have you here and because you sit in this particular area, another thing that many Zimbabweans are up in arms about or feel pained about is the cost of fuel. So since we have you here, why is it that we are paying much more than everyone else in the region, yet we are told we are blending, which is meant to be, we understand, mitigating the cost?
Right. I'll start with the blending one. We blend petrol at the moment at 20%, at 10%, I think, or between 10 to 20%. Basically, what that does is that it reduces the amount of imports which we do for fuel coming into the country, especially petrol, by the percentage. If it's at 10%, it's 10%. Yeah. If it's at 20%, it's 20%. So that's a huge economic benefit in terms of the potential drain of foreign currency out of the country. The second issue is that biofuels are green. Everyone talks about renewable energy. If you look at the strategy for renewable energy, one of the issues which Zimbabwe is recognized for is their blending as a way of greening their energy. So biofuels are green because they are made from ethanol is made from sugar, and sugar plantations are a huge carbon sink because of the photosynthesis. They absorb that carbon dioxide. So it helps us to green our energy space and also reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So the issue of the price of fuel in Zimbabwe is a very transparent method in terms of how we price fuel in Zimbabwe. There's a statutory instrument which is available for anyone to look at it. But I'll just run through what constitutes the pricing. It's the FOB, which is an imported price, which you can't change. It moves together with the international prices. And then there's the transportation cost through the pipeline or by road. We are landlocked. So our prices, like those of South Africa who are sitting at the coast, you find that even if you go to a country like South Africa, there is even a coastal price of fuel as compared to the one which is someone who is in Joburg or inland. So there is transportation costs because we have to transport our fuel either by road or by pipeline up to Zimbabwe, which is different from any other country. So when you are comparing, you are not comparing the same. But there are also taxes and levies, which are also country specific. And Zimbabwe, by its nature, we have our duties, we have our Zinara levy, we have the carbon levy, different levels. And those levels of levies and taxes are different from country to country. They're not the same. Some countries don't charge much duties because they have more formal economies where they collect most of the revenues from the other taxes.
Okay.
We are predominantly an informal economy, but every one of us uses fuel. Even if you don't pay tax, you will use fuel. So that's one way of us getting levels. But to be honest with you, the part of levies and taxes and duties is really a Ministry of Finance issue where they look at their books and see how best they can balance them. I'm not an expert. I'm an engineer.
So they're the ones we should be taking aim at.
But all I can say is that it's almost like a sin tax. Some people would do that on tobacco or alcohol. So it's some of those issues which countries use to collect revenues from their population, and which is then comes back into the economy anyway in one way or the other. So the comparisons are there, and we acknowledge that, but we are consistently reviewing those issues to ensure that we remain competitive, and we engage with the various stakeholders to make sure that we remain competitive.
The reviews are always upwards, or never down.
No, what I've found is that when fuel prices are going down, people don't say much about them. We are all quiet. The moment the international prices change and start going up, we are now all under pressure. Now I'll call you next time when the prices are going down and tell you that you see now the prices
have gone down. We look forward to that being called many, many more times to see the price of fuel going down. But we must end this here. Earlier you said you gave a plea to Zimbabweans to say, please pay your electricity bills. Can you give us the commitment that those who don't pay, regardless of who they are, will be cut off? Because ultimately that's how ruthless we have to be.
Yes, I think for me, I'll go a step further to say cutting off is something obviously which used to be done in the past. But what we want ZESA to do, and we are working with them to do, is to install smart prepayment meters so that you will cut yourself off. If you don't load it up, you just go off. And it doesn't matter who you are, that will then happen. So it's something which most countries where there is efficient collections, they really depend on. So it's an area which we're working closely with them to make sure that they move to that level. And I think once you do that, then it takes away any questions and issues. Yeah, but over and above, what we also want people to do is to use that electricity efficiently. Efficient use of electricity is critical to ensure energy security in this country, and even it reduce the level of imports, which we do. A lot of us go home. By the time we go home, we have left lights on in our offices, and there's no one there. But when you get home and you get load shed, you start saying ZESA, yet you left your office with lights on and there's no one for another 8 to 10 hours. So energy efficiency is key. And even when you're at home, I'll just use a typical domestic consumer and commercial. When even air conditioning in offices, it has to be switched off. And we should come up with mechanisms which can detect occupancy in the rooms and are able
cut
to
off
switch
those
off
that are not being,
automatically, so that we take away the forgetting part of the human being.
Okay.
But also we want people at home not to have all lights on because you're at home. You only have lights on where you need them to be. And it's important that we do that, because it also helps when you are paying the right price of electricity. It also helps you to reduce your bill.
Because you're using it properly.
Yeah, because you are using it properly. And when the price is not right, the behavior is that you then switch on all the lights and you expect ZESA to then charge you very low prices. Yet we are not using it efficiently and for productive use
purposes. I think the message has been struck home. We all have a part to play in this. We all have a part to play in the rebounding of Zimbabwe, and that's why we'll continue to bring you this program. My name is Farai Mwakutuya. I want to thank you for tuning in again. I want to thank Dr. Gloria Magombo, Secretary for Energy and Power Development, for being a guest here, and my earlier guests. Stay tuned for much, much more on this program.
Magetsi ari kuenda, especially kwandogara Glenwood akutorina magetsi izvozvo. Tatorara murima nhasi. Uye price yacho hazviri nani pakuti dai anga asingaende zvaiva beta. Kuti todhurirwa magetsi acho aripo. But kunoita on and off, unotorara murima mbavha dzotoita advantage.
Haasi kuenda, but ari kudhura.
Magetsi ari kudhura. Tikatenga magetsi mwezi hausi kupera nemagetsi atiri kutenga tichifunzira pamwe mwezi tingangopedza nawo.
Magetsi kuenda haasi kuenda, but magetsi ari kudhura.
I'm from Manicaland, particularly I reside in Mutare, and concerning the issue to do with ZESA, I can say that we've been noting a huge improvement in terms of load shedding, but considering that we're getting into winter, there is need for more electricity to be available, so that at least, especially for mothers and their nurturing roles, it will be important for them to have warm water to birth their children, prepare food, and carry out their daily routines, since it's getting cold. And for those people who are living on plantations, for example, who are engaging in agricultural activities, it will be important as well to have more supply of electricity so that we can cater for winter farming.
Ari government yatibatsirawo yatidzikisirawo magetsi because hey achakuwara.
Kumbiro chedu ndechekuti magetsi vakatidzikisirawo tokwanisa kuwanawo maunits akati opindizana pakutenga magetsi edu. Noti convert kuisa mari tichiconverta kuisa ma-US it's almost 30 US kutenga magetsi per month, and so mari yakawandisa zvisingaiti.
In terms of pricing, electricity is still beyond the reach of many Zimbabweans, considering that like our salaries are very low, so it's beyond the reach of the majority. Of course, there are discounts that are being given, but considering what we're getting and the percentages that we have to put towards electricity, we can say it's still very, very high.
Dava improve service kuti kana magetsi pakaita report yoti magetsi aita 40 watendwa nekukasira. Zvekudhura hazvo odhura achiwanikwa zviri better.
What we're doing currently is when we're not using it, we make sure that we're switching off the lights, and at times we use other alternatives such as gas when we're reheating our food or when we want to warm our water.
Uye vanhu dai taedza kutiwo panoshandiswa masola toshandisa masola kuti kana tichikwanisa kushandisa masola giza zvibatsira nemagetsi edu nekuti mashoma zvingatibatsire.
Or a recommendation that I might have is for us to use maybe energy sustainable means such as solar, so that we can at least harness our local resources such as solar and wind to generate electricity, because the more we get, it means the more productive we become.